Welcome to the Dog's Way Podcast, episode 74. In this episode, I continue our discussion from podcast 73 about Skinner, his 4 quadrants of behavioral modification, and some big questions about dog training philosophy and some mistakes in application. I'll be right back.
Welcome to the Dog's Way Podcast, where we solve dog problems by training people. Because, let's face it, your dog couldn't possibly download this podcast on their own. And now your host, here he is, Sean McDaniel.
Thank you, John Melly, for that introduction, and welcome to the Dog's Way Podcast, episode 74. If you've listened to podcast 73, you know this is part 2 of a 2-part series. And if you haven't listened to podcast 73 and you don't know that, go back and listen to podcast 73. So that's kind of the only little preamble I'll give you today, since this is a part 2 of a 2-parter. We won't do any sponsorships or emails or housekeeping or anything. The only little warning label I'll give you is that if you're listening to this first and you didn't get the whole primer and theory of Skinner's 4 quadrants and some of the history of conditioning, go back and listen to podcast 73 and then jump back into podcast 74. So with that caveat being said, let's jump right into part 2 of our conditioning series. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part series here. Podcast 73 and 74 sort of go together in our little, I guess we were calling it a mini course on kind of conditioning, the background, Skinner's 4 quadrants, the theory of that stuff. Today in podcast 74, we're going to talk a little bit about the big broad argument between sort of the purely positive camp and then sort of the other camp, the camp, I guess, that I'm in, and why I guess I use all 4 quadrants and why some folks in the more positively focused only training reject some of those quadrants and only use 1 or 2 of Skinner's quadrants. And so there's sort of 2 general things to cover in that, I think, and then we'll jump in kind of quadrant by quadrant, and I'll go over some mistakes I see in applying techniques in each one of those quadrants. So the 2 big kind of general categories that we'll jump into first is the idea that positive only or positive focused trainers reject the use of the idea of positive punishment, and I think probably reject the use of negative reinforcement. And I'll walk through why they have those concerns and why we should be aware of those concerns too. But the other big kind of, I guess, what I would consider mistaken thinking that we'll go through is the disconnect between something that gets studied in an artificial situation in a laboratory and then the much more complex environment of real life dog training. And so sometimes that result that you get in, say, a Skinner box in a positive reinforcement only operant conditioning experiment doesn't translate into real life dog training. And we want to kind of understand why that is. But first, let's jump into kind of the big discussion that's out there between the 2 kind of different camps of dog trainers. So in that purely positive training camp, that would be the camp of trainers that work, I'd say, primarily in the positive reinforcement quadrant. And then their sort of corrective behavior would fall into the negative punishment. So they would use positive reinforcement and negative punishment as their sort of tools, and would certainly reject, I think, the positive punishment, and would more likely than not reject the negative reinforcement. Because in both of those cases, the positive punishment and the negative reinforcement, recall that's kind of like the alarm clock, right? You're taking something away, but to take something away, you have to add it. That's that weird one that doesn't quite meet the definition. You're adding some sort of unpleasant thing so you can take it away once the dog or the kid complies, or you comply with your alarm clock or the buzzer in your car for your seatbelt. So let's talk about that for a sec in terms of why folks in that camp would just reject parts of Skinner's 4 quadrants. And there's reasons for that too. I don't want to make, as you've maybe figured out by now, that's not the camp I'm in, or that's not the way I kind of, what's the phrasing today? That's not how I identify. But it's important, I think. I don't want to oversimplify their argument, because they do have valid concerns. There are concerns that we want to know about. And so let's address those. I think the positive focused trainers kind of, at least from what I've heard, have sort of 2 criticisms or challenges with positive punishment or a correction in dog training. One is that it causes aggression, and two is that it just kind of doesn't work because, you have to re-correct. In other words, it doesn't totally extinguish a behavior. Once you've gone through a little protocol of correcting a behavior, it can crop up again. It's exhibited here or there down the line, and so therefore it hasn't completely worked, so it's ineffective, so don't use it. I guess probably ahead of dealing with each of those criticisms, I think what I would say is the broadest brush way I can kind of summarize this for you, just as kind of an encapsulation of the difference in the conclusion I've come to relative to the conclusion that positive only trainers have come to, is that kind of a weird start to a rebuttal, but I agree. I wouldn't say those concerns are invalid. So are those possibilities? Meaning, is it a possibility that you will get an aggressive display from a dog if you issue a correction? Or if a series of corrections are given at the wrong time or in the wrong way, could that contribute to some aggressive display? I would say, yeah, that's a possibility. And might you have to re-correct at some point based on the fact that a behavior hasn't been totally extinguished forever? Yeah, that's a possibility too. The only difference, I think, in the conclusion I've come to and the conclusion the positive only trainers have come to is that if we just totally throw out correction as a tool for dog training, it's kind of the dictionary definition of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, meaning valid concerns. We want to be aware of that stuff. Something has to be kind of dealt with, but we're eliminating an input for a lot of dogs that can actually help us and don't result in those sort of negative outcomes that are potentially valid concerns in a small number of cases. So that's kind of the general difference between the conclusion I've come to and they've come to. But let me kind of address both of those things. So in the concern about aggression, there are dogs that will respond like that. And those are a minority of dogs. I'd say maybe 1 or 2% of dogs out there that are real, quote unquote, problem dogs, that if you have a conflict of interest with them, they'll turn around and take you out, and then they'll go deal with whatever it was they were going to do before. And so there are some dogs like that. There's no question about it. It's not the majority of dogs, but we do want to be aware of that. So we want to be aware of kind of the demeanor and capabilities of a dog we're dealing with, and we want to be aware of that possibility. So I guess the way I would sort of describe that, though, too, is that it's kind of a finessed difference, but I think it's an important difference in assessment. And that's that does fairly consistently applied correction at a minimum threshold of effective communication level create aggression, or does it reveal aggression that's there and is going to show up at some point in the future if we ever have a conflict of interest with a dog? The reason I say that is that a lot of people call me prior to doing any kind of correction with a dog, and their dog has bitten them or their dog has bitten someone in their house, when they've just tried to do something where they go, hey buddy, let's go into the laundry room, and they go, I don't want to, and they kind of grab them by the collar and they sort of push them in there and they go, oh no, you got to go in the laundry room, or you got to go in your crate, or we got to get in the car, and the dog bites them because they're just like, no, I don't want to. If I have a conflict of interest with anything or anyone, I bite them. And I guess the way I would sort of put that is that the physical moving of the dog didn't create the aggression. It sort of revealed the fact that that's kind of a genetic predisposition in that dog. And if they have a conflict of interest with anything or anyone, they're going to lash out like that and display aggressively. And so a lot of people kind of uncover that by accident, where they just go, oh, hey, we can't go over and kill that cat. You got to come back over here. And the dog turns around and bites them on the leg. And they weren't issuing a correction. They weren't doing anything, but they did have kind of a conflict of interest with the dog where they would go, hey, let's not kill the cat today. And then all of a sudden the dog kind of turned around and hit them. So I think that that's the distinction I make in that. I don't think that fairly applied, consistently applied minimum threshold correction creates aggression. I think it kind of reveals that that's that particular dog's response to any conflict of interest. And so I guess I'm kind of implying it, but I'll come right out and say it. Can you elicit an aggressive response from a dog if you are inconsistent and unfair and issue some kind of correction over and above minimum threshold of effective communication, and that dog kind of feels like they're randomly being put upon. Yeah, I've seen that as well, but obviously that's not how we would apply a correction in training. So my advice to you about that is don't do that. Don't unfairly sort of create a situation where your dog feels like they're just randomly being put upon. The reason, by the way, that I kind of assess things that way is you can see the genetically predisposed parameters of how a dog will act out or not act out in the corollary of that too. Like, for example, if you're training, those of you who do like patrol dog training or protection dog training or something like that, and a dog's in kind of a training program and they're learning to do some bite work games, and then you get them up to a sleeve and you get them up to a bite suit and you get them up to kind of that scenario where they have to handle a little bit of pushback, particularly in a patrol dog situation, because you do have to take them through a methodical process where they can handle some pushback. Because guess what? If they have to go into a warehouse and take down some perpetrator, then most people that are getting attacked by a dog are going to push back. They're going to do something. They're going to swing a 2x4. They're going to hit them they're going to punch them. They're going to do something that involves not just shaking their arm going, ah. And so it can't look like sort of Schutzhund or sport kind of stuff. You have to develop some test and pushback to see if a dog's going to kind of fold up when they receive pushback when they're doing bite work, or are they going to kind of push through that? Are they going to have the courage to kind of push through that? And so that's actually what you would call it. You call it a courage test. As at some point in any sort of patrol dog program, you have to, with a bunch of candidate dogs, you have to take them through a little bit of a methodical psychological pushing to see, hey, do you have it in you to kind of do this job, or are you just going to kind of fold up if someone just calls your bluff? And so that's what you do. You sort of push them with a bite suit. You walk up, the dog barks, they do their thing, and then you walk right up to them and stand right there. And some dogs will bite the bite suit, and other dogs will kind of start exhibiting submissive, friendly dog body language and go, hey, can't we all just get along? I didn't know you're actually going to walk up to me like that. I thought, most people just run away when I do that. And so you want to make sure that in some kind of patrol dog training program or military dog training program, you want to test that. You want to see like, hey, what's sort of the psychological resilience of this dog? Are they going to hold up, or are they just going to kind of fold up? And so what you're seeing in that kind of a test is sort of the corollary of what we were talking about before, right? Where a dog kind of sounds blustery, but then if you just kind of push them a little bit and you walk right up and you don't respond in a fearful running away sort of way, they just stop. They go, hey, I don't really have it in me to kind of do this bite work thing. And I think I'll just, why don't we be friends? And so that's a dog that I've seen a bunch of dogs like that, it's really hard to get them to bite. Even though they're a German Shepherd or a Rottweiler or whatever, they just kind of go, well, no, I'm good. I didn't know you're actually going to walk up to me. So all that being said, what I would say is that idea of a correction creating aggression is, I think, pretty rare. I think what people are seeing, if they're seeing that kind of reaction to a correction, is they're seeing the genetically predisposed response that dog just has to any kind of physical conflict of interest. If you don't let me do whatever it is I want to do, I'm going to bite you. That's my thing. That being said, we do want to be aware of that. We don't just want to kind of push through all that and just go, oh, well, who cares? I'm just going to correct anyways. We have to kind of determine that. The other piece of that too that we want to be aware of when we're training is that it sort of depends on when we issue a correction and at what level and for what reason. And so if a dog is super fearful and they kind of bark and then back up and we correct them for that, that could be detrimental to the process because they go, hey, I was super afraid of that thing, and now I'm kind of afraid of you. And so we can make matters worse sometimes with a correction. So that's why I don't want to sort of, straw man the concerns and the arguments against correction, because I think we need to be aware of those. And so we've just kind of come to different conclusions. The reason, by the way, that part of the reason I came to that conclusion of keeping correction in the mix in training for me is that sort of as a direct response to what you hear from a lot of positive focused trainers, where I've heard lots of those trainers say, well, you just don't need correction. In other words, don't correct what you don't want, Just train them to do what you do want. Replace the behavior with something else. And I think sometimes that's good advice, but a lot of times it can create an ongoing problem itself. I'll give you kind of an example of that, meaning that if you sort of just take quadrants out of your potential inputs that you will use for a dog in training, it totally changes the possibilities or the parameters of your problem solving. The epitomizing example I always give for that is a seminar that I was in. I was a newer trainer, and I was kind of in that, I've alluded to it before, there's kind of that category where, that new trainer that you're taking everybody's seminar, you're reading everybody's book, and you kind of have this feeling of like, this trainer's really got it all figured out. They have the answer to everything. And you kind of then go to the next trainer and the next trainer and the next trainer. And I was in one of those seminars. It was for professional trainers. So everybody in the seminar was a professional trainer. And I remember there was kind of a Q&A session, and there was, I think, like 10, 11, 12 of us there. And one of the trainers, and the vast majority of them, I think almost all of them, except for me, were purely positive trainers. And I had been trained in that scenario. I had kind of already sort of shifted out of that. I wasn't kind of fully in that camp anymore. And one of the professional trainers at this seminar was asking a question, and they said, "Hey, how would you deal with this scenario?" And it was super embarrassing. I was at the park with a client, and their dog the other day, and my personal dog was there, and there were these kids walking by with, they had ice cream cones in their hand, and it was super embarrassing because my personal dog just snatched an ice cream cone out of one of these kids' hands, and I was just so embarrassed. And, what would you do? And I'm thinking like, holy cow, yeah, that would have been embarrassing. All right, man. Oh, that's weird. And then I look around, and like every one of the trainers there are nodding kind of in acknowledgement, like, oh yeah, I hate it when that happens. Oh, wow. And I'm thinking like, everybody's had this experience? Because at that point, I already sort of had come to the conclusion that like, I would just correct that. Shouldn't we just correct that and take that away as a possibility? And then the seminar leader, the internationally renowned trainer from the UK, was there, and she was nodding her head too, going, "Oh yes, that's, that can be really embarrassing." And I'm thinking like, what? Like everybody's had this experience here? And the response from the trainer doing the seminar is, I think, really illustrative of how differently you would solve problems if you only have one or two quadrants you're dealing with. And her response was, "That's why it's very important to teach a very good heel." And I sort of did the RCA dog thing. I was like, what? And what she described was, well, past kids with ice cream cones, if your heel is very focused and very good, you just heel your dog and boom, no problem. They can't very well be doing a good heel and taking the kid's ice cream cone, can they? And that was the solution. That was kind of the real world example of, don't correct the thing you don't want, just teach them the thing you do want. And I hear that a lot too with like jumping, for example. Just teach them to sit when they greet people instead of correcting the jumping. Just teach them what you do want them to do. The challenge with that is that the vast majority of dogs are actually smart enough problem solvers to figure out what the implied default rule is. In other words, you do solve the problem, right? That is a solution. It's what I would call a coping solution. You definitely can stop a dog from taking an ice cream cone out of a kid's hand, or a dog from jumping up on someone, by giving them an obedience command. And if they're good enough at that, then yeah, you're right. You can't do a sit or a heel and do something else. It does cope with the problem. The challenge with that is, as I was kind of mentioning, is that a dog can figure out what the default rule is. Oh, I get it. So yeah, it's okay to snatch ice cream cones. It's okay to jump up on people, but it's kind of your responsibility to sit me or heel me or leave it me or or give me some obedience skill to prevent me from doing the thing I want to do. And that's provided that it works perfectly, right? The default rule is, yeah, do whatever I want. Jump on people, take ice cream cones out of kids' hands, do whatever I want, unless you sit me, heel me, leave it me, and give some obedience command. So that's just personally, I guess I'm just giving you my bias too, is that doesn't work for me. There's just some things I want to teach a dog, hey, we just don't do that. And so we create kind of more a permanent rule. And so what I do is, for jumping, for example, if a dog jumps up, I pop to the side with the leash, I correct that. And then you can go through and do, hey, let's do it. Let's do that sit thing. Let's, if we're greeting kids, let's down. So if we're a big dog, we're lower down. And you can set up sort of a protocol or a policy for how we do meet people. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that from what I've seen, we also have to address what not to do. And so the reason that I've kind of erred on that side of training philosophy is that the last 20 years or so, what I've seen is that I can't tell you how many people have come to me after training for a year or 2 or 3 somewhere. And they'll tell me like, yeah, we've been working on the jumping, but yeah, it's getting a little better, but he still jumps on like every other person that comes in the door. And we'll work for a week or 2 consistently with some setups, and we'll just simply correct that. And then we'll go back to their setup, sit upon greeting and, accept petting without mouthing and all that kind of stuff. That's all good stuff. But after a week or 2, all of a sudden, boom, 99.5% of the time, no jumping. And a lot of times, and the reason that I know that works so much better than what they had been doing with a purely positive previous trainer is that I ran into the problem of clients sending kind of like a complaining email to the previous trainer going, hey, we worked with you for 2 years. And, all of a sudden in a week or 2, we're, dog's not jumping. What the heck? What's going on? And they get upset. So I actually affirmatively ask people to not do that anymore. Like, we don't have to start fights. Let's just move on with what we know now. And I get it. You're kind of frustrated, but, please don't send an email to your previous trainer. And so that happened so much that sort of outlined it for me that in that particular case, 98% of dogs don't have a problem with that. As a matter of fact, they actually look more settled after a week or so of consistent interaction like that. My anthropomorphic kind of subtext to that is a lot of dogs just kind of like look at you like, oh, okay, well, why didn't you say you didn't want me to jump? I didn't know you didn't want me to jump. It was just kind of exciting and fun and useful. And so all that being said about sort of the aggression concern, good concern to have, good to be aware of in a very small percentage of dogs. But with the vast majority of dogs, what I've seen is that sometimes if you just add that well-timed, consistent, fair, minimum threshold correction into your training, all of a sudden it just becomes very clear. Whatever the policy is you're trying to get across to a dog becomes very clear. So the little warning label I would give to you too is that if you've already seen aggressive displays in your dog, please don't listen to a podcast or watch a video course or watch a TV show or read a book and try to deal with that yourself. Deal with that in person with a trainer that's dealt with that before and kind of knows what safety protocols to use. So that's a good thing to be aware of, and work with a trainer if you're dealing with something like that. But it's not my experience that the vast majority of dogs don't benefit by consistent, methodical, minimum threshold correction for certain behaviors, and it just sort of fast forwards you in training a lot. The other concern is kind of a less severe concern, I guess, and that's sort of the charge that, well, it just doesn't really kind of work because you have to recorrect every once in a while. Like the durability of that conditioned response through positive punishment, it doesn't last as long, particularly as compared to a conditioned response through positive reinforcement. And that's true, meaning if you compared the two, a conditioned response from positive reinforcement lasts a bit longer once you take away the reinforcing reward than does a conditioned response from positive punishment when you take away the correction. But what I would say is that they're both not permanent, meaning you may have to recorrect every once in a while with positive punishment, and you certainly have to remind a dog about their obedience skills. If you just stop training in obedience, that's going to go away. If you don't kind of refresh that and remind that and maintain that periodically over a dog's life, you have to do that. So that criticism of it doesn't really work because it doesn't totally extinguish a behavior forever is, I guess, my rebuttal to that would be that it seems intellectually inconsistent to me. Because we don't judge positive reinforcement that way, right? Positive reinforcement doesn't teach a dog something forever. We have to remind and retrain and maintain that. And so I don't see people saying, well, positive reinforcement doesn't work, because once you've trained a dog to do something, it doesn't stick forever for their entire life. So what I would say is that ongoing obedience, whether you've taught a dog something or whether you're teaching a dog to not do something through correction, is something that just has to be maintained. And so that's been my conclusion for that too, is that I would prefer to keep a full spectrum of communication so I can teach a dog what I want them to do, positive reinforcement, and teach a dog what I don't want them to do, positive punishment. And so that's the conclusion I've come to for that. So I think that leads us to our second big kind of general point before we get into the quadrant by quadrant stuff. And that's kind of a mistake, I guess, that I feel like happens in thinking that occurs when we're sort of assessing the difference between a univariable artificial experiment that's done in a laboratory in behavior, and then the much more complex scenario of, say, training a dog in real life. So a lot of the research in dog behavior is well done, right? When you do a laboratory experiment, when you set up an experiment in anything, if it's chemistry or biology or behavior, ideally what you want to do is set up an artificial situation that rules out a lot of other variables, so you can just look at your independent variable and your dependent variable. You want to narrow it down as much as you can so you can determine what's causing the effect that you're seeing. If the variable you're testing is creating an effect, and then you know, oh, well, we did X and Y happened. So there you go. Y looks pretty dependent on X. But by definition of a good experiment, you have to create an artificial situation. And so if you're doing an experiment that just uses positive reinforcement only, like a Skinner box experiment, you're ruling out everything else. You're taking out distractions. You're taking out any other interests. You're keeping an animal at 80% of their normal body weight so that they're literally starving, so that food has primacy in motivation. Man, I need food because I'm literally at a starvation threshold. Literally, you're using a starving rat or a starving pigeon inside a box that has nothing else to do except peck a target or step on a stair, or, that's it. You don't do an operant conditioning experiment with a rat in the middle of the forest, because you'd lose the rat. It'd be gone, because there's all kinds of other stuff to do. So there's always kind of a disconnect between an artificial single variable laboratory experiment and the application of those results in real life, because there's just other things going on. To use sort of the analogy to, a Skinner box experiment with a rat and training a dog, very few of us are willing to keep our dogs at 75 or 80% of their normal body weight so that we can ensure that food is a consistent motivator, right? And very few of us take our dogs for walks inside Skinner boxes. So you're dealing with a situation that is very much unlike the artificial environment that a study was done in. It's not to say that that's invalid. It's just to say that the application in real life may not actually work the way it works in the laboratory experiment. So that would be kind of my, rebuttal in the thinking of the purely positive. That's why I didn't stick with purely positive training, why I sort of expanded out to use a wider variety of inputs. But in the specific application, so let me talk kind of just really specifically about mistakes in dog training in each quadrant. So in the quadrant of positive punishment, if you're applying something like a correction in dog training, the biggest mistake that I see people make is kind of that general mistake that I talk about a lot of not meeting minimum threshold of effective communication. So I think that happens because sometimes people are just skittish about applying a correction. We've been told you're kind of a mean person or a bad person if you apply a correction on a leash and a collar with your dog. And so we kind of do it a little bit. We do a little bit of a correction because we're not really sold on the whole concept, or maybe we feel bad or something like that. And how do you, a couple of little tips, how do you know that you haven't met minimum threshold if you're giving a correction in training, is that there's kind of two ways, to know you haven't achieved minimum threshold. One is kind of a weird phrase, but the way I describe it is that if your dog sort of exhibits what I'd call whatever body language, right? Your dog's doing something, your dog getting their nose in the garbage can, and you go pop on the leash, your dog just kind of glances at you and goes like, whatever. And they put their nose right back in the garbage can. In other words, they're kind of nonplussed about your correction. They're like, yeah, whatever. See ya. I'm going to keep doing my own thing. That's just an obvious indication that you haven't quite made your point. Your point was get your nose out of the garbage can, or whatever the thing is that you're correcting. And the other indicator that you haven't reached minimum threshold of effective communication is exactly kind of what I described with that nose in the garbage can. If they just go right back to the same behavior a few seconds later, then really by definition, because minimum threshold of effective communication is using the minimum level of communication that makes your point or affects behavior. So if you haven't affected behavior, just by definition, you haven't reached minimum threshold. So if you're seeing that, then you have to get to minimum threshold as quickly as you can so that your dog goes, oh, geez, I didn't know getting in the garbage can was a bad deal, or jumping up on someone was wrong. And so you have to get there quickly to be definitive and understandable. And then the other big thing is you have to be consistent with that communication. And so I see this sometimes. I actually just saw this on a YouTube video. Somebody sent me a clip of a YouTube dog trainer on YouTube, fairly popular dog trainer on YouTube. And he was walking a dog and trying to teach a dog to not kind of pull on the leash and go out the door. And the dog would go out in front of him and he would stop the dog on the leash, but kind of gently and talk to the dog. And what I heard him say was, "No, ma'am. No, ma'am, we don't walk out there until I go out there. No, ma'am." And it kind of wasn't really a correction, though he was stopping the dog. And then on a couple of the occasions, he sort of handed a dog a treat to get their attention again. And to my way of thinking, and it doesn't matter who it was, because it's just to assess it objectively. It's, I think just assessing the behavior is probably the best way to sort of look at that. So my criticism of that interaction would be, if you're really trying to communicate to a dog, hey, don't pull on the leash or don't bolt out the door in front of me, then issue a correction. Give a pop on the leash or be more definitive and turn your back and go the other way until the dog stops pulling on the leash. Then when a dog makes the right decision where you stop and they stop on a loose leash and they head check and they look back and they pay attention to you on trial 3 or trial 4, then if you're using treats, then you can go good and give them a treat for making the right decision. But trying to lure them back with treats and saying, "No, ma'am, no, sir, that's not what we do. We don't pull on the leash. We watch me like a good dog." That talking to a dog like that, not only is it not positive punishment, not only are we not applying a correction at minimum threshold of effective communication, the risk is that we're positively reinforcing the exact behavior we're trying to stop. So I would say, if you're going to apply a correction or experiment with that stuff, I would look for the effect on the behavior. I would look for how to achieve minimum threshold as quickly as we can to be definitive and understandable with the dog. I would just kind of apply that correction or don't apply that correction. Don't sort of halfway apply a correction so that it's confusing to a dog. So that's kind of the positive punishment mistake that I see made most. The positive reinforcement mistake that I see made most is there's kind of 2 categories to this. One is actually just not applying positive reinforcement properly. So if you're introducing a dog to a behavior, if something's new or harder, we always want to use a consistent reward schedule, meaning every time the behavior happens, they get rewarded, whether that's a toy or a piece of food or a pet, or verbal praise that your dog likes. We want to consistently reward that behavior when it's new. And then we want to transition into what Skinner called a variable ratio reward or intermittent randomized reward schedule, where if you're using a treat, you would give that treat, every couple of times and then 3 in a row and then every 4th time and kind of mix it up a little bit and vary the ratio of when they get it. But they certainly don't get it consistently and every time. And then we slowly kind of decrease the frequency and wean off of that. The mistake shows up like this, where people go, "Yeah, I tried giving my dog food for sit 4 times in a row. And then you know what? I tried one without and they just didn't do it. So, they only do it when I have food in my hand." And that sort of experience is, there is some truth to that. There is some truth to that sort of experience and criticism. But if you're not actually applying a variable ratio reward in weaning off of food, then you're not doing it right. So I would say, if you're going to do positive reinforcement, do it correctly and go through that consistent and then variable ratio reward schedule. The other type of mistake in the positive reinforcement quadrant is sort of I guess could be best described as just giving a dog a treat at the wrong time or for the wrong thing. So this kind of manifests in 2 different ways. The first way is a little simpler to understand. And so I think the shortest way I can describe it to you is giving a dog a treat for the stopping of bad behavior. So the way I see this crop up a lot is for jumping or barking. Your dog jumps up on someone, you say, "Off," or "No jump." Your dog listens and responds and gets off, and you say, "Good, no jump. Here's a treat." Or your dog barks and you go, "Quiet." And your dog stops barking and looks back at you and you go, "Good, quiet. Here's a treat." And what ends up happening with that is that most dogs are smart enough to figure out that cascade of behavior that results in a treat. So it's only one step removed, but essentially you're positively reinforcing the bad behavior. So we don't want to do that, obviously. The way to remedy that is to just obviously not do that. But if you're going through setups with jumping or setups with something that your dog's going to bark at, with the jumping, for example, what I do is if we walk up to someone and the dog jumps up, what I do is I use positive punishment to correct that. So I give a pop to the side on the leash, and then we go away and come back and try it again. We try a second trial and a third trial. On the second or third trial that they stay on the ground, then we go, good pet or good treat. We positively reinforce the better, correct decision in a second or third trial. So always do a second or third or fourth trial and then positively reinforce the better decision or the correct decision in one of those subsequent trials. Don't reward the stopping of a bad behavior. Otherwise, you'll get more bad behavior. It's roughly the equivalent of giving a kid an ice cream cone at the grocery store if they'll stop having a tantrum. So the other manifestation of this mistake in the positive reinforcement quadrant of giving a dog sort of a reinforcing reward or treat at the wrong time is when people give a dog a treat while they're in the middle of a bad behavior. I see this mistake kind of crop up when people are attempting kind of a counter conditioning process. So counter conditioning is kind of like your dog has some reactive behavior one way or another towards some triggered thing. And then you're trying to expose your dog to something they like, create that opposite emotional state. And pretty soon they associate the thing that used to trigger a bad reactive response with that good emotional state, and you kind of flip the script on them a little bit. It's a little bit like actually that when we talked about in part one in the last podcast of John Watson and his experiment with the little kid named Peter, where he was trying to sort of decondition or counter condition that kid's inherent fear response to little white fluffy animals. And so the mistake kind of looks like this. You see it sometimes. I actually saw a video a few months ago with somebody giving this advice on YouTube, and they were saying, if your dog barks at people that come in the front door, just make the people coming in the front door be a good thing. So keep a bowl of treats by the front door, and when someone comes in, have them, grab a few treats and throw them kind of across the entry to your dog. So your dog will start to go, oh, wait a minute, these people are giving me treats. And so I guess it's a good thing. Instead of me barking at them, I'll like them. And so that's sort of the thought process if you're going through that step. So the mistake, you might have actually kind of figured out the mistake already, is that if the timing of that event, that triggered reaction, and the intensity of the triggered reaction already goes to that kind of level 8 or 9, in other words, it's a displayed behavior, and then you have someone throw food treats at the dog because you're trying to kind of give them a good thing that they like in the way that you might think about doing positive reinforcement. The problem is that if your timing is wrong and if the displayed behavior has already happened, then you end up positively reinforcing the exact behavior you're trying to dissuade or counter condition or change. The key to that, by the way, in the counter conditioning is the underexposure. That's kind of where that minimum threshold of effective communication comes in, right? You want whatever that triggering stimuli is in a counter conditioning setup, you want that to be underexposed. That's why that white fluffy rabbit was way off in the distance in that John Watson Peter experiment. He used distance because there are 3 elements, as you probably know if you've listened to previous podcasts. There's 3 elements that make any distraction more or less severe for your dog or for a kid, I guess, for Peter in that experiment that Watson was doing. If you change the element of distance, movement, or surprise as kind of an element of that object of distraction, it will become a more or less severe distraction. And so you have to kind of play around with those elements to underexpose your dog. If that's the experiment you're doing in a counter conditioning kind of setup, you have to underexpose that triggering thing before the displayed reaction happens, before it blows up, and then expose them to something nice. And then they kind of go, hey, oh, there's food here. Oh, that's cool. And then you go back to re-expose them to the triggering distraction in maybe an incrementally slightly higher level. And then you redirect them and expose them to this food that they really like. And they go, hey, oh, there's food here. Yeah, I forgot. And so counter conditioning has to happen below minimum threshold with a triggered distraction. So that's kind of some technical mistakes you can make trying to positively reinforce with food. And then the other thing too, the kind of mistake, I guess, generally with positive reinforcement is that, particularly with food, is that I talk to a lot of new trainers that they're trained in food reward only training. And that's kind of it. That's their tool. That's how we train a dog. And there's probably like 40% of dogs out there that just aren't food motivated enough to be trained with food. And so you get a dog like that and you just go like, well, he's not very trainable. We're kind of done. Because I had hot dogs like literally on his nose and he was just like, nah, I'm going to sniff the ground. I'm going to go over to that other dog. I'm going to go chase that squirrel. You keep your hot dogs. I don't care. And so that's kind of a mistake in positive reinforcement too, where you just go, well, that dog's not trainable. Well, forget it. And so that's one of the reasons. That was my experience actually, is there's a lot of dogs like that were just like, forget it. And so we just deem them untrainable. Oh yeah, this dog can't be trained. They can be trained, most of them. You can't train every dog. 100% of dogs aren't trainable. A lot of them, a very high percentage of them are, but only a small percentage are actually food motivated at the right level to get trained functionally in real life and never use another technique or method with them. So if you run into that, I would encourage, if you're a trainer or if you're a dog owner and you run into that and you just go, yeah, my dog's not food motivated, then you have to find some other method for teaching them stuff. And so that's where sort of non-food training comes in. So our last two categories, negative punishment and negative reinforcement kind of mistakes. Negative punishment, the mistake that I usually see falls kind of into the category of mistakenly assuming the value of the good thing that we're withholding. Because recall that negative punishment is we're trying to dissuade a behavior. And so we're going to take something negative. We're going to take something away. And so what that looks like, I see this a lot on some dog training YouTube videos where for barking, like a dog barks at the front window and you walk over, you grab them by the collar and you go put them in their crate in the laundry room. In other words, you kind of seclude them. You take away their freedom or you take away their access to you or you take away their access to the rest of the house. And that taking away, negative punishment, trying to dissuade the barking at the front window, for some dogs, that works. In my experience, it's kind of rare that it works because it's not very clearly associated. But the big mistake that happens is that we're assuming that freedom that the dog has is going to be really meaningful, or said another way, meet minimum threshold of effective communication. It's going to be meaningful enough that dog goes, wait a minute, I barked and you took away my freedom and put me in the crate in the back laundry room? Oh man, that's terrible. I don't think I'll bark at the front window anymore. If that freedom is really important to that dog, or their access to you is really important, and you consistently do that, meaning they don't get to bark at the front window with impunity and every once in a while you put them away, then sometimes that can work. But the reason that it works rarely is that freedom may not be meaningful enough to affect a negative punishment input. So what I mean by that is that if your dog barks at the front window because they're kind of concerned about the thing out the front window, and then you take them away from that thing out the front window, in other words, you take the concerning thing away, you're actually taking away an unpleasant thing. So now you've just turned what you did into negative reinforcement instead of negative punishment, right? You've just encouraged more barking at the front window because they went, hey, there's a dog out there and that's really freaking me out. I don't like that. And you grab them and you put them away in their crate in the back laundry room and they go, thanks, that's great. I feel way better now. And you've just reinforced the barking at the front window. So that's kind of an example of how us misassuming the value of the thing we're taking away can flip what we think is negative punishment into negative reinforcement, which probably leads us to negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement, I think, is kind of, that's that kind of misunderstood one, right? Negative reinforcement's like the alarm clock. So sometimes the problem that can happen with negative reinforcement, like the thing I was describing with the e-collar and the recall, where you hit the continuous button and you only let off of the continuous button when the dog starts coming back to you. Sometimes we overshoot that unpleasant stimulus in negative reinforcement, particularly that technique. It's one of the reasons I actually don't use that technique in recall I use e-collars, but I don't use that technique for recall with e-collars, because what happens a lot with negative reinforcement is we apply that's that weird one where we're taking it away, right? But we have to apply it first to take it away. So if I hit that continuous button, a lot of times that's so distracting or overshoots minimum threshold that a dog kind of forgets what it is we're even doing. And so it just becomes that that stimulus that I apply becomes kind of a distraction in the scenario, and it just confuses them. And so that's kind of a mistake we can make in negative reinforcement. But I think that negative reinforcement also, there's another little misunderstanding with negative reinforcement, that it doesn't have to be super unpleasant, meaning kind of my say and show technique. Like if you're teaching a dog that isn't food motivated to sit, where you just say sit, and then you take the leash on the front end and you have a couple of fingers on the hind end of the dog, and you just apply some pressure up and back with the leash and down and back with the fingers on the hind end of the dog. You apply some pressure until, and it might be intermittent pressure, until a dog just starts to sit. As soon as they start to sit, you take that pressure off. That's negative reinforcement. And so it's not super unpleasant. It's not super annoying. It's just a little bit of directional pressure. It's also a bit of guidance. But as soon as they start doing it themselves, I take that pressure off and they go, oh, that's easier. Oh, look, I'm in a sit. Look at that. And so that say and show sort of technique, when we're training a dog that just isn't food motivated, and we're training a dog that way, that's negative reinforcement. So I think negative reinforcement is also kind of underutilized in training. And that, by the way, if you're a trainer out there and you were like, hey, yeah, I had a dog that's totally not motivated by food, that's one of the ways you can start teaching a dog basic obedience, by just saying and showing a dog in what I would call a teaching phase in negative reinforcement, guiding and showing, and then releasing that pressure as soon as they do the command, comply with the command. You can use negative reinforcement to start to teach a dog to do that kind of stuff. So there you go. You made it through both podcasts. That's a lot of info. So I'm impressed that you made it all the way through. Thanks for hanging out with me. Hopefully that gives you guys just a better kind of foundation in conditioning and that introduction to Skinner's 4 quadrants, and getting a handle on that stuff and how some of those techniques fit in there, and some of the mistakes that can happen when you're applying different techniques within some of those quadrants. And mostly, I guess I wanted to do this for 2 reasons. One, to give you guys a little more confidence in what you were doing and your ability to assess stuff, and kind of make sense out of some of the information that's out there too. There's just a ton of information out there on dog training. And so I guess my hallucination is that if you guys know more about the kind of whys and foundational pieces of what's going on, you'll be able to assess kind of critically your own experiments that you're doing with your own dog better. And with that goal on kind of getting results, you'll be able to kind of go through that process of try something out, see if you get the result. If you didn't, go back, re-examine your hypothesis, and kind of follow through that method of just getting results. So hopefully that did that for you guys in our little two podcast mini course there. And if there's anything that you feel like I missed in the whirlwind abridged version of conditioning or Skinner's 4 quadrants, or if there's some important piece you feel like I should kind of add to the mix there to educate the rest of the listeners on, feel free to send me an email on that. And if there's any questions and clarifications you guys need, obviously feel free to send me an email or a Facebook message as well. We're on Facebook. And also, if you're in that camp, that purely positive or mostly positive focused camp, and you feel like I kind of misrepresented you or strawmanned you a little bit, and you want to sort of set me straight, feel free to send me in an email and correct me. So there you go. Until I talk to you in podcast 75, go have some fun with your dog. I'll talk to you next time.